The one thing we know about government policy in 2010, one thing they wanted to do was get the deficit and the debt down. That's two things, the deficit and the debt. And that's what they stood for, less public spending. And the evidence that I compiled in my 10 years on review was that had a very deleterious effect on the health of the population and on inequalities in health. We don't want that.
We really do need to embed the principle of fairness because unfortunately, many of the people who've been most affected by this crisis, the young people who may have been in the gig economy, those young people graduating from university or indeed from college this year, who will find it hard to get jobs, and we know that is likely to impact their entire future earnings if they find it really hard to get jobs now as they graduate. These young people are actually the very young people for whom climate change is going to be the biggest impact on their lives and their livelihoods. So in thinking about how the government implements a green recovery, we really must make sure that the people who end up paying for it are not those with the least ability to pay.
How useful do you think it is to continue using GDP as the measure of our economic success?
I have long had an idea, which is not very radical, that health is a better measure of a society's success than the state of national income. So it should be that we should stop privileging GDP as the one marker of economic success and social success, but we should be looking at the health and well-being of the population. And that would give further impetus to action on climate change. It would be further impetus if we did what Julia said, and we put fairness at the heart of all policy making. We would improve health and reduce health inequalities. So it's an entirely different way of thinking about the state, the role of government, and what we define as success.
GDP is a very brutal measure that really doesn't describe quality of life that people in a country experience particularly well.
GDP goes up in some cases, in many cases, if you damage life.
Yeah.
I mean, so if you have extra profits on, creating pollution, on building prisons, on manufacturing guns, on paying security guards, then GDP is going up. And so the very simple thing that we could do is we could replace that. Well, one alternative is a genuine progress indicator. It's all very well thought out. Another alternative is the Human Development Index, but with an adjustment. So that measures GDP, life expectancy, and years in school. And you could just replace the GDP element with real wages, so that you don't have this perverse result that when people profit from pollution and death, it looks like you're doing well.
The drive for GDP, for economic return, is this absolute drive to sweat your assets, to have no slack in the system. And I think what we have learned is that actually to be resilient, sometimes you do need to have some slack in the system. You do need to have more beds in the hospital than you need to use. You do need this resilience built in. And actually our drive for everything being just in time, every asset being sweated, every bed being almost permanently occupied, because as soon as you get a patient out, you get the next one in. That gives us no ability to respond when these risks arise, as we know they will, as we can predict they will. So we've got to go back to thinking about how do we run a system where we have this resilience, which in some areas does mean we need some slack, if you like.
It means that we need a total rethink. We've already, in the last session, talked about a total rethink in terms of a green economy, the crisis of climate change, but we need a total rethink about how we value the people who make this fundamental contribution to our well-being.
I mean, governments all around the world have been getting more and more into debt since the 1980s. And it's mainly debt to banks, right? So government debt benefits the financial services sector. If a higher proportion of GDP is interest repayments to the financial services sector, then, well, that's good for banking profits, but it's not so good for taxpayers. We need to invest to get out of the crisis. I mean, you can't cut your way out of a depression, right? You need to invest out of a depression that you face. But then you've got a question about how you distribute the costs of that. And that's a political decision. And the political decision so far, after the global financial crisis, was to put the costs onto the people who could least afford it. And that was austerity, cutting public services, cutting local government. And what we need to do is restore our tax system, but probably also change corporate governance a little bit so that shareholders and CEOs of companies don't earn astronomical returns, often for doing very little, and shop floor workers and people of middle incomes get a pay rise.